All right, thank you everyone for attending. My name is Heather Tillwine. I'm an assistant professor at Austin Peay State University. I'm also the communications chair for the LGBTQ Health Caucus for the American Public Health Association. I want to welcome our panelists to our webinar about two-spirited individuals. We're very excited to have them. We have an hour for a presentation, and then we're going to leave the last 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any, please enter them in the chat, as I will be monitoring that throughout the session. With that said, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Chase Breyer, is a Chickasaw Two-Spirit and current doctoral student in behavioral and social health sciences at Brown University School of Public Health. We have Jay Ford, Nyingum and British from Mi'kmaq, and is a non-binary Two-Spirit indigiqueer resident physician at University of British Columbia's Public Health. We also have Cameron Carley, a queer non-binary Japanese student doing a master's in educational research with specialization in curriculum learning at the University of Calgary. And then Harlan Pruden, a Nihiyao, First Nations Cree, and works with the Two-Spirit community locally, nationally, and internationally. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and take it away.
Great. Okay. Greetings, my relatives. Okay, there are going to be some awkward transitions here because, of course, we have our sections for our presentation, but we actually didn't talk about who's going to talk first. So, on behalf of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, which is Turtle Island's first ever research group, that solely focuses on Two-Spirit people, communities, and experiences, I would like to welcome to this conversation today on who and what is Two-Spirit. What do you mean Two-Spirit simply doesn't mean an LGBT or lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and the list could go on, Indigenous person. And the awkwardness is it does and it doesn't. So it's just, we're going to kind of like tease this out a little bit. I would love to, first of all, witness, honor, and acknowledge Heather, as well as the LGBT caucus at APHA, for seeding space and or creating a space for us to host and hold this conversation that is near and dear to our hearts. Seeding space, like I know that for many non-Indigenous people, when they hear the call of like land back, and you hear that within many Indigenous communities, if you're a landless organization and a landless entity, right? What does that mean? Well, what I would like to say is it means this: seeding space and creating space for our Indigenous and Two-Spirit relatives and kins, so that we may host and hold and sing our story and sing our songs. I am so honored and incredibly blessed, and it makes my heart sing to sit here in community with Cameron, Jay, and Chase, who will be doing a brunt of this conversation. Now is my turn not to be singing this song. I've sung this song often solely and doing many presentations for the last like 17 years or 20 years. And it is so beautiful that I no longer have to sing alone anymore. So with that, I would like to also witness and honor and acknowledge. I'm joining you from the non-traditional, from the territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, on whose territory I work, live, and play. And I would like to just thank my hosts for allowing me and tolerating my presence in and on their territory. Jay, since you're closest.
Gway Nindaluisi Jay Ford. Hi everyone. My name is Jay Ford. My pronouns are they and Nagum. Nagum comes from Mi'kmaq Simgu, which is the language of my ancestors, the Mi'kmaq. And it's the only singular third-person pronoun, and it's gender inclusive of all genders. It does not separate masculine and feminine, as many colonizing languages do. And I also want to offer my sincere gratitude and gratefulness to the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, in whose land I am currently calling to you from, and offer them from the bottom of my heart, my spirit, my soul, the caretaking they've done for these lands, waters, and this territory since time immemorial. And I am a person of mixed ancestry, so I am mixed Euro settler and Mi'kmaq, and grew up in Uk'dagamguk, which is the island of Newfoundland, is what it's colonially called. But I moved to Vancouver, BC, to pursue my residency training in public health and preventive medicine. And I'm a proud Two-Spirit Indigiqueer person with trans non-binary experience. And I want to hand it over to Cameron.
Hello, y'all. My name is Cameron Carley. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I am a queer non-binary Japanese European settler who is currently on Mohkinstsis. Mohkinstsis is a Blackfoot word that describes the landscape of so-called Calgary, Alberta, and it is the land of the Siksika, Ghana, and Bakani nations, alongside the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda nations. The Stoney Nakoda nations include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and it's also the land of Métis Region number 3. I not only want to acknowledge the land, but I also want to acknowledge that this land is culturally significant to Indigenous peoples. And there is still so much for me to learn and for many, many people to learn about what land is, and also about what land acknowledgements are and how they function and some of the caveats and limitations to them. I don't want to just be reading off a script. I want to make sure that when I not only acknowledge the land, but when I acknowledge the histories of Indigenous peoples, I'm doing so from the knowledges of Indigenous peoples to make sure that's not a performative action. And I thank you to each person who has taught me how to do that. And I will hand it over to Chase.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chase. I'm Chickasaw. I was born and raised in Oklahoma, but as Heather noted, I'm currently at Brown University, which is known as Providence, Rhode Island, on the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care, continues as a sovereign nation here today. So very grateful for them, and thank you all for joining us.
All right, we kind of sped through the introduction. So this is us, this is our lab members. Unfortunately, this list has not been updated, but we have around, is it believe 30 lab members now, 30 to 40-ish around? Yeah, I believe so. We are a collective of both Indigenous and settler people, researchers, scholars, and it's a really, really beautiful lab, and we'll be talking about it a little bit later. We've done our land acknowledgements, and I guess I'll just get into it, yes? All right, lovely. I can't see anybody else, so I'm gonna just take that as a yes. So at the beginning of this first part of our presentation, Chase and I are gonna be talking about who Two-Spirit peoples are, some common misconceptions of Two-Spirit, especially regarding queerness, the history of Two-Spirit peoples, and also how the name Two-Spirit actually came about, some specific roles that Two-Spirit peoples hold within their respective Indigenous communities, some names for Two-Spirit peoples within specific Indigenous languages, alongside some case examples of contemporary and historical Two-Spirit peoples, alongside Two-Spirit peoples' implications within the American Indian boarding school system. So I'm going to begin off by talking about the concept of Two-Spirit per se. So from a settler's perspective, Two-Spirit is a Indigenous gender or a Indigenous sexual orientation or sexual identity that exists outside of the Western conceptualizations of what gender, sexual orientation, and sexual identity are. And often Two-Spirit is kind of lumped into ideas of queerness, specifically within the acronym 2S LGBTQIA+. And we really want to push against this, and we want to push past this, because Two-Spirit is actually what we call an organizing strategy or an organizing tool. And what we mean by that is that Two-Spirit peoples had, and they continue to have, a very culturally significant role within their respective Indigenous communities. And this role is predicated on a gender analysis. So it's not necessarily a Indigenous gender, but it's a gender analysis because it refers to the specific roles that they hold within their communities as the roles that Indigenous men hold in their communities and Indigenous women hold in their communities as well. And so it's more of a gender analysis instead of a gender, and it doesn't really have anything to do with sexual orientation per se, and it never really did. And we'll kind of get to the understanding of how sexual orientation came to be a play in this, in quite a colonial way, unfortunately. I also want to note that since it's a gender analysis and a organizing strategy or tool, it's not an identity. And what we mean by that is that identities, it's almost implied that identities have endpoints. There's almost a finiteness of it, a like clean-cut definition. So for example, when I used to identify as a gay man, I thought to myself, well, I'm a man, I like other men, that means that I'm gay. And that idea was reinforced not only by myself, but it was also reinforced by other gay men that I met as well. There was this singular definition that it was kind of like, okay, this is the endpoint, that's it, that is me. And so Two-Spirit is not an identity because, number one, the way that we kind of isolate who Two-Spirit peoples are is that you need to be Indigenous to Turtle Island, and you also need to have a specific gender analysis that is associated with your role within your Indigenous community that exists outside of being a man and being a woman. And so to go into, and also before I proceed, I also want to make it very clear that because Two-Spirit is exclusive towards indigeneity, settlers cannot be Indigenous, although some settlers may claim to, settlers cannot be Two-Spirit. Although settlers may claim to be Two-Spirit, they are not because it's exclusive towards indigeneity, and Two-Spirit continued to exist pre-colonization. So I want to make that distinction quite clear. But within regarding Two-Spirit and the LGBTQ, the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, there are some limitations here because, number one, queerness is inherently a colonial construct. It was created by settlers, it was created for settlers, and it's also reinforced by settlers as well. And so to lump Two-Spirit peoples into another colonial construct, that very much so does a disservice and is an act of colonization. And it also very much so erases the beautiful ambiguity and diversity that comes with, that really comes with Two-Spirit. Because in Western ways of knowledge, we're always trying to find one comprehensive answer. We're always looking to isolate something into a succinct definition. In this way, we really need to make sure that we recognize, and we not only recognize, but respect the way in which Two-Spirit is purposely complex and ambiguous and multifaceted, and really make sure that we uplift it and we don't try and contain it into something that it is not really. It's a way of respecting not only Two-Spirit, but also Indigenous ways of knowing as well. This isn't to say that Two-Spirit people cannot be queer. They can definitely be queer, 100%. But since it is a gender analysis and not a specific gender, nor a sexual orientation, nor a sex, we need to make sure to give space to Two-Spirit peoples who do not identify with the queer community, especially because queerness is a colonial construct. I also want to note that Two-Spirit is a noun. It is not a verb. It is not two-spirited because Two-Spirit is not a specific action. And it is also not an adjective. It is not Two-Spiritness because Two-Spirit does not describe a thing, I guess. Two-Spirit is a noun and it deserves to be treated as such, especially because we come across quite a few times where we see it used as a verb and an adjective. So pre-colonization, different Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, they had a specific language to refer to Two-Spirit peoples by within their respective Indigenous languages. And many of these nations actually had more than two genders, 3 genders, 4 genders, up to 10 genders, I believe. And there were also Indigenous nations that had 0 genders as well. However, when CC, and I'm not going to say his name because he does not deserve any more recognition than he already has right now, when he came and discovered Turtle Island, and I think that we can be on the same page here, whereby Indigenous people discovered CC. He came and with him and other Europeans, they brought very restrictive gender and sexual binaries with them that had very specific rules to them, especially regarding appearance. For example, there were only two genders, there were only men, there were only women, there were only two sexes, there was only male, only female, and the only acceptable sexual orientation was heterosexuality, men being attracted to women, women being attracted to men. That's it. There was no room for Indigenous people who were two-spirit, and also all of the nations that had more than two genders, there was no room in this really limiting and colonial framework for that. And so when Europeans came, they saw two-spirit peoples, and they saw that strictly by appearance and the way that they lived, that they didn't fit into these binaries. So for example, in regarding to appearance, you saw two-spirit peoples with a men's top and a woman's skirt in very binary terms, or a two-spirit person who was perceived to be a woman and they were doing the work of Indigenous men. And so because these people did not, because two-spirit people didn't fit into the restricting binary, colonizers came up with a word to describe two-spirit peoples. And I want to emphasize that this is not a word that Indigenous people ever claimed, nor they continue to claim. And it is quite a harmful word with quite negative connotations. The word is barja. It is a French word. It comes from a Persian word. No, I'm getting my words mixed up. The word is berdash, that Indigenous peoples, that European people use against two-spirit peoples. It originates from the Persian word barja, and it basically means somebody, a male who is the subordinate of anal sex, so somebody who is receiving anal sex. And it means that in a very derogatory, demeaning way. And so this word was used against two-spirit peoples, and essentially was used within academia, was used within conversation, and was used up until 1989, 1990. If we're flashing forward to 1975, in the Bay Area in so-called California, the Gay American Indians organization was formed, and it was formed by Barbara Cameron and Randy Burns alongside other Indigenous community members. And through this organization, they engage with other queer and or two-spirit Indigenous folks around their own experiences, their own lives, their own identities, really. And so they engaged in conversation up until 1989, and then in 1990, the third annual Basket and Bow Gathering was held, and the Gay American Indians organization called a Grand Talking Circle. And one of the big discussion points was the word berdash, and they found that this word, it was negative, it was demeaning. It had to do with a sexual orientation analysis and also a sex analysis, none of which had to do with two-spirit peoples. And so they wanted to create not only a term that they could use that really resonated with them, but also a term that all Indigenous communities across Turtle Island could use, something that was really special to them and meant something to be celebrated instead of disregarded. And so they came up with the term two-spirit at the end of the talking circle. And they said that it represented both the masculinity and the femininity of the roles that they held within their respective communities. And so this was not only a celebration of identity, it wasn't necessarily a celebration of not just Indigenous autonomy, but it was also a political action as well. It very much so promoted Indigenous identity. It promoted Indigenous land. It promoted Indigenous ways of knowing. And they made this term very, very public that it would be used in the future. However, research continued to use the term Berdache up until 1995 and 1996 as well. And so we want to make sure that this term is, that upper dash is entirely erased as well. The only reason I bring it up is for historical context, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that this was a term that was never claimed by Indigenous peoples. So on this slide are a few different roles of the roles that Two-Spirit people held in their respective communities. You have, for example, Cree Two-Spirit peoples who are mediators within their community. And this is in regard to the division of labor that is gendered. So, for example, Cree Two-Spirit peoples, they can traverse between the divisions of labor of Cree men and Cree women. And so if there was ever any imbalance of labor, they were able to restore that balance. This is in contrast to Sioux Two-Spirit people, whose specific role is name-giving within name-giving ceremonies. I also want to specify that there are also differences within specific nations. So you have Cree Two-Spirit peoples being mediators, but you also have Cree Two-Spirit peoples being the creator of love potions and also having the role of matchmaker. And so again, it really promotes this idea that Two-Spirit cannot be contained into one singular definition, and it's also not an identity either. I also want to really make sure to emphasize that because of colonization, this basically resulted in the attempted erasure of Two-Spirit peoples. And so with the specific roles that they held within their communities, such as the name-giving ceremony, the Sioux Nation couldn't perform name-giving ceremonies as they had pre-colonization. And so this not only had the colonization and attempted erasure of Two-Spirit peoples, it not only had implications for Two-Spirit peoples, but also to the nations in which they belonged. And so across these next slides, these are some specific names of Two-Spirit peoples across Turtle Island in their respective Indigenous languages. And this is such important work of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab because one thing that we really prioritize is community engagement. And as I go through these slides, I really encourage you to look through the different nations, the different terms, and the loose translations for them as well. But when we go to different Indigenous nations for community engagement, we engage in dialogue with them. We talk about the work that we do, who we are, who Two-Spirit peoples are. And some nations, they don't have the understanding because of colonization. And so we're there to really make sure that we not only engage in dialogue with them, with the understandings that they have, but we also make sure that we engage in very open ideas that Two-Spirit is something to be celebrated, and it's something that predates colonization and continues to exist today. And so if we are lucky, we actually we are gifted a word that describes Two-Spirit in the nation's specific language. And I really emphasize the word gifted because there is a historical and also present exploitation of Indigenous knowledges by settlers that basically use Indigenous knowledges for the purpose of furthering settler agendas and also just for the benefit of settlers as well. And so we recognize that this knowledge and these names, there is a responsibility that comes with the gifting of these names. And we want to make sure that we do a great service to the nations who have gifted us these names, because this knowledge is important. This knowledge really helps make sure that Two-Spirit peoples, not only in the present, but also in the future, they're able to engage with their culture in a way that really resonates with them and that is culturally significant. Because although Two-Spirit is a very incredible word and term that helps Indigenous people identify with their culture, Two-Spirit was created in response to colonization. They had language to refer to Two-Spirit peoples, and that language needs to continue to be revitalized. So we do not take this lightly, and the work that we do, we want to make sure that we do it with responsibility, and we also do it with respect. I'm going to pass it over to Chase now.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Cam. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so as Cam was mentioning, a huge focus of our lab efforts has been on collecting tribal-specific traditional language that honors the existence of Two-Spirit people both historically and today. And this is really important, especially here in the US context, primarily in the South, where there are rampant structurally violent efforts and policies that cause direct harm to Two-Spirit communities. So the importance of reclaiming these words as community organizing tools cannot be overstated. And I thought this recent exchange that I had on Facebook with a prominent Chickasaw language expert from my own tribe at the Chickasaw Nation would be a perfect way to illustrate the important role of Two-Spirit in Indigenous queer youth in organizing around traditional language to really promote safety and cultural resistance. And as you see from the post, after inquiring about the most recent translation of Two-Spirit, Josh, our tribal language expert, responded with this translation of Two-Spirit for the Chickasaw people, Shalom Bish Toklo, that was recently articulated to reject former Two-Spirit definitions that were inherently pejorative. And this to me really illustrates how Indigenous youth are also contributing to meaning making and cultural organizing when it comes to Two-Spirit discourse. You can go to the next slide, Kim. Okay, so it's also critical to understand that other cultures outside of Turtle Island also have words for expansive notions of gender that predate colonial labels of gender and sexuality. And for those unfamiliar, Turtle Island refers to the continent, what is now known as North America, and is based on Indigenous worldviews such as the Anishinaabe and Lenape oral traditions that tell of a turtle that carries the world on its back. So just a bit of background there. And as you can see on the slide, these traditional language expressions are reflected all across the globe, from Asia, Indonesia, the Pacific Islands, to Malaysia, to Africa. So it's really important to acknowledge that these cultures, are also really critical in conceptualizing the ways in which colonization really introduced rigid gender binaries across Turtle Island and across the globe. Next slide, Kim. Yeah, well, there aren't many pictures of Two-Spirit leaders across time. We did want to highlight a few Two-Spirit heroes who really paved the way for Two-Spirit existence today. First, on the left is Weha, who is a member of the Zuni tribe in New Mexico. She was the Zuni equivalent of Two-Spirit, and in 1886, she was invited to visit Washington, D.C. By prominent anthropologists and other political figures. And during that visit, Weha met President Grover Cleveland, and her representation really shed a spotlight on the existence of Two-Spirit people to a wider US audience. And on the right is Oshtish, who is a leading Two-Spirit of the Crow Nation and held an esteemed position in her tribe. In the Crow Nation, it was not only acceptable for one to be Two-Spirit, but they were often regarded highly as being the bridge between two genders, being Two-Spirit. Oshtish was allowed to take on traditionally female and traditionally male roles and excelled at both, and was esteemed not only for her amazing sewing skills that earned her the right to make her chief's buffalo skin lodge, but she was also known for her ferocity in war efforts. Her strength as a warrior is what earned her name, Oshtish, which translates to finds them and kills them. So fun fact there. Next slide, Kim. We'd also be remiss not to acknowledge a few Two-Spirit leaders today. First, on the left is Sharente Harris, who's a Narragansett tribal member who overcame discrimination through traditional dance. They're featured in a new documentary called Being Thunder, so I definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't yet. Now Sharente uses their voice to explain how our voices can be used to revitalize the traditions of our communities. And they also just accepted a PhD offer here at Brown, so we're super lucky to have them here, I believe, in the American Studies department. And on the right is Dr. Alex Wilson, who's at the University of Winnipeg, and who is a leader in land-based learning, pedagogy, and research methodology, and articulated the coming in theory, which is distinctly Two-Spirit, and it challenges this notion of coming out narratives in mainstream depictions of the lives of queer people, and instead posits that this process for Two-Spirit people is really an act of returning fully present to themselves, to resume their places as valued members of their families, cultures, communities, and lands, and connection with all of their relations. So Dr. Wilson's really doing awesome work up there. Next slide, Cam. So this is a picture of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is one of the first American Indian boarding schools founded in what we now know as the United States. This school opened in 1879 and closed in 1918, and served as the model for other schools that were founded after across the US and Canada. And in these schools, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their tribal communities. And while there, they were forced to learn Christian values, European culture and language, and would face consequences if they practiced or participated in their own Indigenous culture. And these consequences would range from physical, sexual, and or emotional abuse, and many children were killed in these schools. So really grim history. And you may have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation movement in Canada that was enacted to honor Indigenous children who never returned home, as well as survivors of residential schools, including their families and communities. But this sadly is yet to happen at a federal level here in the United States. And yeah, important to note that these schools were only one part of assimilation, but perhaps the most evident illustration. And this photo has everything and nothing to do with the Two-Spirit community. You'll see on the top half of the photo, there are seemingly young men and boys who are all dressed the same, short hair, shirts, and pants. And in the bottom half, presumably young women and girls who are all dressed the same, long hair and dresses. And this is the exact representation of the rigid gender binary system that was forced upon Indigenous and Two-Spirit people through the school system. And there was no room or consideration for anything outside this binary. So the culturally specific roles of Two-Spirit people were totally disrupted in attempts to erase their existence altogether. And to speak against the administrators or the law of the land would result in violence or death. So during this era, Two-Spirit people likely experienced some of the greatest traumas from these residential schools as they were forced to essentially become like foreign Christian binary figures that they were not accustomed to or made for. Yeah, we cannot stay silent about the ongoing impact of American Indian boarding schools because we still see the impacts of these schools today. If there's no opposition or challenge to colonial institutions in the so-called or in the so-called US from settlers, then Indigenous communities are forced to do this on their own, while also trying to preserve culture, experiencing intergenerational trauma, and navigating institutions that were inherently not made to support Indigenous people. Yeah, so I think it's just really important to highlight that a focus on Two-Spirit resurgence and representation is really a political act against colonialism in so many ways that has harmed not only Two-Spirit communities, but every marginalized community.
Chase, thank you so much. And Cameron, thank you very much for showing up as an ally. Also, I think it's incredibly important to pause to look at these sites of cultural genocide in which that many Native Americans or Indigenous peoples were ripped from their community and put into the schools and literally had their Indianness beaten out of. So if you just go to Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the National Center for Dialogues on Truth and Reconciliation based in Winnipeg, you can hear and see some of the testimony from these survivors from these residential schools. On a deeply personal note, this school opened in 1879, closed in 1918. Duncan Scott, under the behest of John A. Macdonald, went down to the school, studied this model, and came back and replicated that model. It also is a nice, people want to talk about this being a dirty little secret, right? No, political campaigns were run on them. Secondly, that dude in Germany, the little one with the mustache, actually came over and studied the system. And it is well documented that the final solution was also based on this model. Americans must own that. Now, on a deeply personal level, I will say that my mother was ripped from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve, put into a residential school along with my aunt, Auntie Pippi, Phyllis, and literally had her Indianness beaten out of her. Where stories that I was like talking about is if you were caught speaking your language, there was this one individual that had a pin driven through their tongue because they knew that if they broke the language, they broke the transmission of knowledge, and thereby we could no longer transmit our ontologies, our Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. That was my mother's experience. So what did she do? She had 3 beautiful children, and she beat the living crap out of us. And there was, I've been living on my own, and I emancipated myself when I was 16, and I've been living on my own since I was 16. I'm not saying it was pretty, because I made some unwise choices. I was only 16. But it was safer for me to be on my own than to live in the dysfunctionality and the abuse and the violence of my household. And so for this woman, I had such a dark, dark place in my heart for her. And through this picture and understanding what represents and what these schools did to us, disrupting our knowledges, and for my mother of experiencing violence, that, and today I have compassion, understanding, and this little bit of love for her, because I realized that she was only doing that which she knew. She was beaten, she beat us. She wasn't spoken to with kindness, she did not speak to us with kindness and love. And it is how these intergenerational traumas, this historical trauma bleeds into intergenerational trauma that is still impacting us as Indigenous people. Chase, the violence that you see experienced within our knowledge keepers for our Two-Spirit people is an aberration of these schools and other genocidal policies. This is not history. People want to look back at, say, oh, in the early 1800s, that this, like, it's history. No, I am still dealing with this personally from my mother. Chase is still dealing with this. Jay, we as Indigenous people are still healing from this. And thank goodness that we have allies like Cam and many, many other members within the Two-Spirit Dry Lab to reconcile and for us to be in good relations with one another so that we may progress as one. So this picture is key to understanding our work, but it is also key to understanding as Indigenous experience, history, and how we show up. Often very angry, justifiably. We on the other side of the lab is that we're trying to do a lab of reconciliation, but we're also a lab of love. And so I sit in community with Cam very proudly.
Thank you for your vulnerability, Harlan. I know I can only imagine how difficult it is. So thank you so much for opening up about your own experiences. Thank you. So really, in conclusion, some key points that I want to reiterate is that Two-Spirit peoples are really at the intersection of those who are Indigenous to Turtle Island and also those who embody diverse sexualities, genders, gender roles, and gender expressions, specifically outside of the conceptualizations of binaries of man and woman. Also, it is not a identity because, as said, identities have endpoints, and Two-Spirit is something that is more expansive than that, something more ambiguous, and it's really important that we make space and we also create respect for things that exist outside of Western conceptualizations of what these roles are. It is different across all Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, and Two-Spirit peoples have always existed. They continue to exist today. And our work of the lab is to make sure that Two-Spirit peoples not only exist, but they thrive, they're celebrated, they're respected, that everything about Two-Spirit is really given the recognition that it deserves. And when I say recognition, it's not the recognition that is predicated on Western ideas of Two-Spirit. It's Two-Spirit peoples predicated on who Two-Spirit peoples are, their own experiences, their own knowledges, and their own everything. And we need to make sure that not only as a lab, but everybody needs to support and uplift that. And I'll pass it over to Harlan and Jay.
Thank you so much, Cameron and Chase, for starting us off in a good way and grounding us in the history of Two-Spirit people and bringing us to the present. And thank you, Malala and Harlan, for your vulnerability and sharing your story. So this next slide is our lab's logo, the Two Spirit Dry Labs logo, and it was created by artist Margaret August from the Seychelles Nation, who is also a Two-Spirit artist. And the logo depicts a moon, which is symbolic to the many cycles in moving forward with conducting of our Indigenous-based research. And the face, the way it's designed, is to represent the balance of feminine and masculine energies with a split down the middle of the face. And then along the forehead, you'll see the salmon faces, which represent our West Coast environment, where we're based on primarily Coast Salish territory. And so this logo brings a lot of meaning to the work that we do in terms of our Two-Spirit methodologies and our two-eyed seeing and honoring and centering our Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being. Next slide. And so this was our lab at our first strategic planning retreat last spring. So we have probably like a third to a half of lab members there, I think. And it was a very fulfilling and heartwarming and spirit-lifting strategic planning retreat that we had at Loon Lake. And we had our elders there to guide us in a good way, Elder Glada and Elder Roberta. And 54% of the lab are Indigenous. And we took this photo when we were trying to meet somewhat safely amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And then around the back of our elders, Glida and Roberta, you can see our lab members ranging from, or surrounding them, and they have backgrounds ranging from social sciences to public health work to medical trainees and practitioners, epidemiologists, artists, and activists, and many of us sharing different and multiple hats. And next slide. And so how we work as a Two-Spirit Dry Lab, we want to focus centering our Indigenous ways of being. And so that involves having our transdisciplinary collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous lab mates in the spirit of reconciliation. So we have, again, the lab members coming from different backgrounds, including epidemiology, knowledge translation leads, sociologists, researchers, community members, artists, and of course our elders to guide us in the work that we do. And our methodologies and approaches are centered in Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being. One of our main approaches is Edwapika, or two-eyed seeing approach, which was a term created by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. And then our meetings and work are always done in circle. And that's how we are formed and led. And we do that work so it's collaborative, non-hierarchical, and we use consensus decision-making process. Next slide, please. And our lab is done with and for shared leadership. And so we draw our team together to find our purpose and deep commitment to consensus decision-making process with the aim or requirement of acceptance by all members. And these are combined with the following principles or tools of leadership that we want to use, which would be equality and conversational turn-making. So that would be our talking circle protocols. And taking time to know one another, and that all knowledge is relational. So a lot of the work that we do is grounded in building relations to one another and to the other partners that we have in the research that we're doing. And then we also want to listen intently or actively, or what we call deep listening, so we can hear one another and hear deeper than just what's happening at the surface level. And the above components create the possibility of psychological safety in the lab, which result in the following outcomes for us, which is supporting each other so that we can bring forth the best ideas, working together in mindful and respectful ways, and developing innovative capacities. And by grounding ourselves in that psychological safety through what we do in our talking circles and our relational ways of working and listening very intently and actively to each other, we can really build good outcomes through our lab. Next slide, Cameron.
Oh, wait.
Harlan.
If you go back, and if you go back to the other slide, these two slides, Jay, thank you so much for like holding place and articulating the how. Because it's important to note that although we are a research lab and that we are coming together to do Two-Spirit research, right? So many research groups is about the what. What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? What's our method? What's our theory? What's our grounded theory? And let's just move forward with that, right? That's important. However, because we're a lab of reconciliation, we're process-based. And so within this slide, and you can go to the next slide, it's the how. How are we coming together? Are we coming together in an honoring, mindful, and I would even say a deeply loving space as lab members? And so a part of this too is that psychological safety. That's that two-eyed seeing approach. We have these time-honored protocols like our talking circle protocol. One feather, one voice, or one mic, one diva. We all must share, and we must share in our beauty of it. And also it's that we're not looking for unity through conformity. One way of being Two-Spirit, which Cam was so beautiful in articulating that, and along with Chase. What we do is that there is conformity through other and or difference. We want people to show up in their fullness. And we want to celebrate that difference and celebrate and honor that other. Those other stories and songs. And so it is through unity, through the acknowledgement and the acceptance and creating space for others and difference. And let's lift each other up. So there's no one way of being Indigenous. There's no one way of being Two-Spirit. And there is no one way for you and for the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, for you to be a Two-Spirit Dry Lab member. We just must work to be in good relations and we move as one. So my role, as well as Travis Sawe, as the co-principal investigators of of the lab, is that if we get to an endpoint and not all the lab members are in agreement, then we have failed because we are not tending to the collective wellness and the well-being of the lab. But we do know that if we get to an output or an endpoint or the conclusion of a project and their conversation, and we arrive all as one, all 36 lab members, we know that wherever we land will be a good place because we move as one and we arrive with kindness, love, and our hearts. And so we're not hooked into the where we're going. It's the more important is how are we going? And so you're already hearing some of those things at play as we get into the lab of reconciliation and how we sit in community with one another. And I don't think many lab groups or research groups are looking at those process-based conversations. It's all about the what. Let's count purple widgets. How do we count purple widgets? And that's it, right? And so also, which you'll hear Jay will now talk about how this extends and ripples out to our community partners and how they become de facto members. And we just add this other layer of consensus decision-making processes. And so this is important work, but I also want to draw this out because I don't think folks are used to hearing this. And I just want to name it, draw it out, because that I think is the beauty of the lab.
Thank you, Harlan. And so this slide shows kind of another way of how we operate and that we are community driven and we're focused more on capacity bridging research. So you'll see surrounding our lab, the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, we have our Indigenous communities, our LGBTQ communities, and our Two-Spirit communities grounded in our host organizations, Chimamuk, SFU, the BC Center for Disease Control, and the Community-Based Research Center. And this diagrams to show the relational nature of our work and the capacity building across different organizations. And so if you can hit the slide once more, Chase, then yeah, there we go. And once more. There we go. So you see the relational aspect to this slide, and that we work with our communities to build capacity to bridge them to one another, and so they can work collaboratively and share their expertise, their knowledge with one another through our lab to work on projects and partnerships together. And I'm going to hand over to Harlan to talk a bit more.
So my new name is going to be Motormouth Mabel, because I'm just going to buzz through this because I would love to move to the conversation. Next slide. Oh, slide there. See, someone's ahead of me. So I just wanted to just dive a little tip-a-toe into some of the work so you can share and figure out. So you share to have a little bit of a deeper understanding of the work that we do. So we started off, and what we've been primarily using was a national data set called Sex Now. Sex Now is known as the gay census. It is one of Canada's largest and longest national periodic survey for gay, bi, trans, two-spirit, and queer men's health, and it's basically a sexual health and men's health survey. It's dating back to 2002, which was paper surveys, but then it went on to online. And one of our projects that we worked on was from the 2015 data set, which was one of the first national surveys that Sex Now went national. Through our work and engagement and asking questions from the 2015 data set, the Two-Spirit Dry Lab said, I think that we can do better, better questions, and we can do better surveys. And so we provided some guidance and direction to the principal investigator, Nate Lachowski, who is also a member of the lab now, to better capture health-related and experiential knowledges of Indigenous participants when they entered into that conversation. Next slide. So back in 2015, Q1, there was a question on, and it's coming, Q1, we asked, hit the button, we asked for gender identity, and hit the button again. And Two-Spirit was offered as an option within this large category. So right off the hop, question number one. Question number two is like, what is your sexual identity? Okay, also it's important to note that, for Q1, gender identity, trans is listed there, right? It's a little awkward. It was like, okay, we've grown a lot, just FYI, right? And then way at the end of the survey on Q70, question number 70, it was like, what best describes your ethnic or cultural origins? And at that time, Aboriginal was used, and Aboriginal was a placeholder. It's from the Indian Act here in Canada that describes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis folks. So we have 3 different categories of Indigenous peoples here within Canada. And so when we pull the data, click once more, 4.5% of the overall of the sample were Aboriginal or Indigenous, giving us an N value of 363. And then we were like, all right, who selected Two-Spirit in Q1 or Q2? And we had 156. And we're like, wow, that's amazing. And I was like, pump the brakes. How many people selected Aboriginal in Q70 and or Two-Spirit in Q1 or Q2? And what we found is that 62% of the respondents that selected Two-Spirit in either Q1 or Q2 were not Aboriginal. And so we're like, what? So we blew them out of our study. So we started off with, of the Indigenous respondents, we extracted all of those, and then we started slicing and dicing the data that way. And so the guidance that we had offered is how to collect Two-Spirit data in a more culturally humble and a more culturally appropriate way. And so this was the guidance that we had offered, and it was implemented in the 2018 survey, the in-person survey. So if an individual, a participant selected Indigenous, click. And then they were also given the choice of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, which that something means here in Canada, or prefer to self-describe. Those are colonial constructs. Maybe they want to identify from a nation specific as like Cree, Anishinaabe, or Chickasaw, or or some other of their nation, right? Or prefer not to say. Sometimes it is not safe to say what nation and or who you are, right? And then and only then did you get the question of, are you Two-Spirit, yes or no? And so when we ran and this was question number 1, this framing. And then so when we ran the data, first of all, we had Indigenous people helping recruit folks and calling people into the survey. So we have a paper written looking at this methodology of how do you increase Native participation or Indigenous participations within survey. 8.9 or about 9%. So there was a doubling within the sample size from 2015. And the breakdown was like 59 or 60, 40, and 3%, which is basically mirrors Indigenous populations and numbers within the broader Canadian society. 42% of the Indigenous respondents said that they use Two-Spirit or are Two-Spirit. And again, what Cam was saying, and I think we also got a question of do all people use the term Two-Spirit? No, not all the people use the term. But the most important part about this is 0% of the respondents were not Indigenous. And so we effectively walled off Two-Spirit to only Indigenous participants. And so next slide. Travis and I were invited by CIHR, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. That would be the NIH of the North. And they published our results within this Meet the Method series. As soon as I'm finished talking, I'll type in that URL so that you have a copy to this guidance and how and the rationale. And so we have the highest level here within the Canadian government is publishing these results. And we know that other researchers are using this, thanks Jay, using this method. And it's so cool because they're like, hey, we have this data. We've asked this question, Two-Spirit Dry Lab, would you like to have access to our database? And so we have many databases right now. And so we're hoping that we can amplify this and have this method used, taken up by many, many other researchers, but also folks within the government. This is also in Q59 in the 28 example. If you look here, the question was, in the past year, which of the following resources have you gone to? So these are all Western modalities of healing, psychiatrists, registered counselors, sex therapists, and the list goes on, right? But then it was none of the above. And I was like, ooh, hit the slide, I hit the button. But I said, many and some, and I know of Indigenous people that do not go to these Western healing practices and seek mental and psycho and social support through elders, knowledge keepers, and ceremonies, right? And so what we did was we created these spaces that were only for Indigenous respondents. So you can click the button once more. And so does your survey question reflect the reality of those that you want to engage? Now, if you click the button back 3 times, this is highly problematic because without those Indigenous respondents, for those that are going to elders and knowledge keepers or ceremony to get their support, this question number 59, they would be like, yeah, I've gone to none of those, none of the above. And then we as good researchers were like, ooh, Native people aren't going to these services. We have to develop a plan. Well, no, you've just asked a really bad question. And that they are accessing services, but you have just given primary to Western knowledges of ways of knowing and being. And now you can click those buttons. And rather than creating a space of how we are actually getting our services and what those services are. So this is, again, creating a 2-eyed seeing approach so that you're honoring both knowledge systems and holding them up. And so we must really look at our questions critically, because in the first one, without those 2 top respondents, we will get into really hot water because we just asked a question not in a good way. All right, some water teachings. And so this is a picture when we were a team of our lab went to Northern California. And so and I remember we were in Haida Gwaii, and I was like talking to one of the lab members, and one of the lab members was one talking about how, you know, they often have to show up in meetings and be advocates and aim or fighting them way their fight into a meeting of like saying, we must do this, right? And what about Two-Spirit people? And I was like, you know, we don't work that way as a lab. We learn from water, and water is like taking the path of least resistance. We go with the flow, or we only go where invited. And then as Jay so beautifully shared, is that once the Two-Spirit Dry Lab rolls into the community, like water, we let the community give us shape. What are your needs? What do you want? And how can we work in service so that you may work with Two-Spirit people in a better way? And so we're learning from water. And so this is our research, our overarching research conceptual framework, our water teachings. Collect. So this is, we're not going to go into a lot of detail around from Ahupa, which is a Northern California indigenous nation, to Haida Gwaii, and that is from the Haida Nation, which is in Northern British Columbia. And so these are our phases of, and this is more of just looking at our conceptual framework for the actual research. So there's the overarching water teachings, and then this is how we actually do the research. And so, and again, as Jay shared, our logo is of the moon and the moon teachings, right? Of showing a balance of masculinity and femininity, and how, as a research, that there are many phases. And so we begin the first conversation within a new moon, where a relationship is established and or reestablished of like, what are your research needs so that you may work with Two-Spirit people in a better way and in a good way. Then we go on to the next, the waxing crescent, where we get to know one another. Like, hey, community partner, who are you? This is who we are personally, but also politically within the lab. And so we both are like a meeting of hearts, but we're also meeting organizationally. Then we go on to the next phase, and we're like, what are your research needs or your resources so that you may work and engage with Two-Spirit people and kin in a better way? And then in the next phase is the refinement of that research question or questions and or for the requested resources. And so like, we were going to ask about like health and pet ownership. We're like, yeah, we didn't ask about pet ownership, so we can't actually run that. And so we have to like, there's ways of nuancing it, or we can't do that question, right? So it's an iterative kind of process, right? Okay, but in the 2019 and the 2020 Sex Now survey, we actually do ask about pet ownership. So we can answer that question. Next phase is after we have our marching orders of this is what our research question is, of like maybe looking at suicidality or like the drivers of sexual health knowledge. Then the Two-Spirit Dry Lab in our fullness in the full moon is the reflection as well as the work of the data analysis, but the resource that we do the work. And then in the next phase, we go back to our community partner of like, this is our preliminary pull of the data. This is the preliminary draft of our resource. Did we hear correctly? Do you have any qualifying information? And if they do, then we go back, refine. But then in the second last phase is in that we formally present the findings and or the resource to our community partner. We turn the knowledge over to them. And because they're not asking for like shits and giggles, they're actually asking for a reason, they immediately go into praxis. They implement and they act upon the knowledge. Then in the final waning crescent, we go back to our community partner and we're like, hey, community partner, can we type up the results? And if they say no, we're like, cool, the medicine is already happening. But if the community partner says, sure, and why we ask is because it's their question, their knowledge, not ours. We are being humble, and we're like looking at relational accountability. We have to honor that relationship and honor their wishes. But if they say yes, publish, we then go back, type up our results, we journal shop, like APHA journal. No, we've yet to submit anything to APHA. And then if the article is published, and if no one reads it, we don't care. We get the citation, that's our social capital with as a research group, as academics, as researchers, because we don't care that no one is engaged with it, because the community has already acted on it. And so the community is already working on the gift, and the medicine is already out there. And so that, I think, is what we try to do. And so this is our research conceptual framework. And it's also important to note is like how many research conceptual frameworks where you see that they're like circles and squares and triangles and arrows, and it's like this system that's all by itself, so that we can own it as ours, and then I can commodify it, and then I can like make money off of it, or I can get an academic post, right? For our systems and our conceptual framework is, how do we own the phases of the moon? No, we learn from the phases of the moon, and we act, and those teachings are brought home. Now we can own how we work and the teachings of, but we can never claim the moon as our framework. And so it's just, and it's also holistic, and it's tied into this bigger system. And so if you all go back to the water teachings, the interaction between the moon and the tides, the moon and water, and we can't claim that. All we can do is to learn from her. And then how do we interact that teachings in our life? So for Haida Gwaii, we are right now in resource development. We're meeting. We got some clear marching orders when we met with them in December. And for Hoopa, we're still refining our questions. And so this is where our placement, and you come back in a month and they will be moved, or they will be like, maybe I have to go back and do some relationship building. But we're always just moving like the moon through phases to assist us. So when Two-Spirit data is collected in a culturally safe and affirming way, health researchers are given the opportunity to promote rigorous science that considers sex and all genders. Research conducted in this way has the potential to expand our understanding of health within an intersectional framework that considers how determinants such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, migration status, age, geography, just to list a few, mutually constitute sex and or gender. By bringing these considerations into focus, they can help formulate health research that is better informed and inform policies and programs that are more relevant, respectful, mindful, and I would even say loving and representative of the diversity situated within Two-Spirit and Indigenous people. So unity through diversity. And so these are some of the water teachings. When we look at this waterfall, we look at the grandeur of it, and like Schneikes, how do we create that? But I'm just reminded that this waterfall, as well as the Niagara waterfall, started but by one droplet. All we're doing is just planting seeds, and hopefully that we are those one droplets, and that other folks will join with us to create the majesty of this waterfall. And we're also learning from water. Next slide. Patience and also determination. Again, if we look at the Grand Canyon, we're like, how? We cannot create the Grand Canyon, right? Yeah, we can. Consistently showing up, patiently, and just doing what water does, flow, and slowly eroding and moving and building. And so the lab, again, is learning from water, and it is how we learn from the land, and then that implements and ripples into our quantitative research as a quantitative research analysis that is working to be in good relations, one with ourselves, in the lab, and then within community. And it is these ripples that we try in our most humble and good way to figure this all out. Is there any other slides after that? References. We used to just be able to say my granny said. Here are the references. Now, our contact information and a formal thank you in my language. It's Kanonaskom Tinina Wawa. And Jay, Cameron, please.
I want to say Walaliak to everyone.
And thank you so much for inviting us all here. It's really, really exciting to be here, and we hope to continue with more conversations. Thank you so much. And Chase?
Yeah, thank you all so much. Really enjoyed sharing space with you and engaging in this important discourse. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you to our panelists for doing this for us. Amazing presentation. So just to start off, some questions for you if you guys are all open to it. So what do you all think that the most pressing public health issues are that are facing two-spirited individuals today?
Okay, one is if we come down to Atlanta, and we hope that we would, one is research. But specifically research, and we can talk about is testing in the null hypothesis, which is one of the core fundamentals of epidemiology and thereby of health research. So as a really good example, like for testing in the null hypothesis, we assume two groups are the same, and as a result, we can do a compare and contrast. So a really good example of this is if you look at the BCCDC the 2016 surveillance report, HIV surveillance report on page 11, it says, Indigenous women are 20 times greaterly impacted by HIV than white women. All right, and then we just reconstruct. How many papers have you read that? Where X minority is less than or less greaterly impacted than white people. Okay, I was born an Indian, I'm gonna die an Indian. I'm never gonna be white. Why should I be compared to white people? And all systems have been created, as Chase pointed out in the residential schools, all systems have been created by white people for white people. And so they're always going to be better because the systems are set up for them. We as minorities are always going to be in a less than position. So I would argue that the testing in the null hypothesis, that very framework, 20 times greaterly impacted by HIV than white women, becomes a site of white supremacy. And then what do we do to close that? Do we make the white women have the same rates of HIV as Native women? No, implicit with that is that we just have to make the Native people more like the white people. And for us as Indigenous people, it becomes a site of colonization. We must stop testing in the null hypothesis because it becomes a site of white supremacy, I would argue, and it also becomes a site of colonization for our Indigenous kin. Now, y'all are like, well, we want to talk about health. Well, we got to talk about it in a good way in which that we are not always in a less than position. And so some of those models, the lab is we use quantitative analysis, but we reject testing in the null hypothesis. And that is our vision, and that is the hope, because you get a fundamentally different conversation. And I would love to share some of the work that we're doing around that and how we're working out these models. But Cam, Chase, Jay.
Yeah, I just want to say, doing the good work and not perpetuating white supremacy is we take an approach of one being community-based, but also fostering, looking at ways that Indigenous communities and two-spirit communities foster well-being and wellness rather than looking at being a risk factor for disease. And that's, I think, a major way we shift the way we think about our research that we do and the ways we build relations with our communities.
I agree. I have another question from our audience. This person is looking at two-spirited individuals as far as mental and behavioral health and how cultural and structural determinants of health could be drivers for culturally centered interventions. How has the pandemic impacted First Nation Two-Spirit people, and what current work is being done to prepare for a future pandemic and impact current practices?
I can start off the dialogue. I think that number one, the pandemic, as experienced by all of us, it was quite an isolating experience for us. Um, and as our work in the lab and everything, like we work in circle, and many circles are in person. Although we're very, very grateful that we were able to meet online, it wasn't the same. And so a lot of Indigenous communities were specifically disproportionately negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically in relation to their culture and the way they were able to meet, specifically different ways of conducting ceremonies, different ways of conducting um, other celebrations. And so for Two-Spirit peoples who are already arguably, in some Indigenous nations at least, marginalized by their own nation, it was an additional aspect of isolation that they had to experience, specifically also being cut off from the supports that they would have relied on, such as elders and knowledge keepers and other forms of support as well. And so in preparation for hopefully not the upcoming pandemic, that'd be nice, you know. I think that it would be very, very helpful to make sure that we learn from what we have experienced during this one and make sure that there not only just supports for Indigenous folks, but also for Two-Spirit folks alike, too.
Okay, perfect. Also, I have another question from the audience. Were the singers, teachers / elders that inspired and helped you learn the processes of collaboration and inclusive movement that could assist other labs, schools, families, etc.?
Sure. Well, first of all, just meet with any Indigenous people. It's built into our sacred teachings. So we're not really doing anything new. We're doing new old ways, and it's new to the Western gaze. So just gaze as in G-A-Y-S and G-A-Z-E. I'm being cute. But if you're looking for some seminal text, I think that there is, Jay, can you just go to the reference section and pull Alex Wilson, or Sean Wilson, Wilson and Hughes, and Evelyn Steinhauer, and just pop it into those. I think Research is Ceremony is a beautiful book. It's short. And I'm sure that for many of our non-Indigenous relatives, it gets a little like esoteric when they start connecting with the stars and the moon and talks about ceremony, but that's literally what it is. It's ceremony. And so if that is a little bit of a challenge after you read that, I would encourage you to pick up the next copy of Hughes and Margaret Hughes, who's non-Indigenous, and Sean Wilson of Why Research is Reconciliation. It's the how do you take research as ceremony and actually how do you operationalize it? And it's a much more how-to book. It's a thicker, I know that they start off with relational accountability, which is a Nehiyaw or a Cree teaching. Sean Wilson is Cree. And then finally, this 2002 paper from Evelyn Steinhauer of thoughts on Indigenous research methodology. And it basically is theory and method because we can't separate the two. And so it's also a deep understanding. And again, it's about relationship and how all knowledge is relational. And it's a really kind of good introductory paper of showing ontologically, it is a critique of Western knowledge production. Often Western knowledge production is knowing and doing is bifurcated. Our indigenous kin, our non-indigenous kin and their little binaries, they separate out knowing and doing, right? And where for us, for how we look at indigenous ontologies on a very broad general sense, there will always be exceptions, but there's indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. Knowing and doing are one and the same. And so you're also hearing that at play from Jay's part about how the lab works, is that we do not separate knowing and doing. Knowing and doing is all one and the same. And so, and then I further showed you the moon teachings and how if no one reads our paper, we don't care because the community already had the teachings, right? And so we're just not only theorizing, but we're also operationalizing our indigenous ways. And then we have, but we also have that two-eyed seeing approach. So Cam's Western teaching is put in harmony with us also. And so we try not to betray both Western teachings, because there are some really good Western teachings, like quantitative analysis. But when quant is married with the null hypothesis, not cool, but quant is good. So we want Western teachings, those good ones, to harmonize and to put into good relations with indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And so again, what you're hearing is this deeply personal meeting of hearts. We want CAM and their Western teachings, and we want all of our lab, non-Indigenous lab members to bring who they are, but let's put it in good relations with one another, with our Indigenous relatives. And so you're hearing that all kind of play out. But I think these are three good texts if you want. And I don't know, Cam, Chase, Jay.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, you mentioned this, Harlan, but we have, 2 elders who are a part of the lab, and that's been great, especially as we kind of reparent ourselves and work our way through these super colonial institutions. And I feel like their teachings are really invaluable and something that I've really appreciated. So just wanted to kind of plug that too, that just the importance of their knowledge and the ways that they are able to shape all the work that we're doing.
Well, yes.
I know that you all work really hard with community partners. What steps do you guys take for capacity building, strengthening those relationships? And do you find a lack of capacity a common theme when working with community partners in your particular region?
I think the water teaching that Harlan shared kind of gives a lot to this question, and that a lot of the partnerships that we have with community are when community come to us. And so we're again following the path of the water to find the places where people are looking to reach out to us, who want to build relations with their Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA Indigenous relatives. And so they've already had that shift in mindset to want to do that work. And so they have already created some space to do that community building and capacity bridging.
Sure. And just building upon what Jay said, is that implicit with, and again, we want to problematize this, capacity building communities, like we as Indigenous people were not supposed to be here. If the colonial project was realized, I would not know that I was Indigenous. And two, I would not be here. They would have exterminated. It's cultural genocide, but at the heart of it is genocide. We as a lab, we know the resilience. We know that communities are here and they have been here for over 532 years of colonization. There is strength there. Now, whether or not we want to acknowledge that, And how we acknowledge it is that we build upon that, we capacity bridge. We don't build anything. How incredibly non-humble of us to like roll into the community to think that we're going to build something when they're not supposed to be there. That every breath that they take is an act of resistance. Every exhale is an act of survival or survivance. So we merely build upon the strength. So we, again, like the water teachings, we go where we're invited. There is strength and capacity there already. How do we strengthen that? And how do we build upon that and bridge that and work as an ally, as a partner, so that they may thrive as a people once again? All Indigenous people. And that thrivance also is Two-Spirit inclusive and honoring as we were. So bridging is what we do. Building is not what we do.
I love that term bridging. I will start using that actually when I talk about community partners. For our last question, are there other organizations out there that are focusing on Two-Spirit health and social justice that you want the audience to know about?
Yeah, there are Two-Spirit organizations across Turtle Island that you just have to like do a little hunting. I know that we have a resource that lists many of them, and we know also just humbly meeting with Two-Spirit people and being curious and humility. You will be more than equipped to find out what is going on. Like yesterday, I went to a celebration from 2 to 7. Jay joined me, and there was like close to 100 people there that began, and then it swelled. I couldn't count anymore, and it was a Two-Spirit celebration, awareness and celebration day from people across Turtle Island that came together to lift one another, to pause. But also what was so beautiful about that event, and when I gave my remarks, is gone are the days of fighting. I don't want to fight anymore. Fighting to get at a table, fighting to get into meetings. I was exhausted. Where today it is celebrating, honoring, and love, and being motivated out of love, even in a quantitative research group. Love is sustainable. And what I heard yesterday was the community was no longer fighting. We were just coming together to celebrate and to be. And the other major message was that there's no one way of being Indigenous, there's no one way of being Two-Spirit, and that we must celebrate others, and we can get into good relations. We really want to be in good relations and break down these camps, break down these barriers. And so there can be really a meeting of hearts and minds, which sounds so incredibly heady for a scrappy little Two-Spirit dry lab that does quantitative, non-feelsy qual research. Sorry, my qualitative relatives and kids, but people really listen to numbers. We will take on that fight later on, but we will do it in a good way.
Qualitative research is so important as well. I think it doesn't get enough credit that should, especially when we talk about health and people's experiences. We have one more question if you all are free to answer it, because I think it's a great question. This individual said, I've tried to explain survivance to my students. Could you unpack that term a bit?
So it's survival and resistance. It's just like again, breathing, like every inhale is an act of survival, taking in what is needed. Every exhale is just an act of resistance. Am I answering the right question? Survivance. Yes. Chase, Cam, Jay.
Yeah, and it just it kind of spends to like, or kind of talks to like the vibrance of our community and the vitality that we have, and inner resistance and inner celebration of ourselves through our survivance.
Yeah, we're still here. Like Harlan was saying, that's kind of what comes to mind. I love the way that you kind of framed that, Harlan. I really couldn't agree more.
All right. Thank you to our panelists for answering those questions and that great presentation. This video will be on our website, the aphlgbtq.org. I took all the resources that Harlan posted and we'll compile that and post it with the video as well. Feel free to reach out to any of the panelists or myself if you need a copy of the video because you can't access our website or wherever it may be. Thank you all again. This was so much fun and really great time. And I hope I see you all in Atlanta or at Quad S in New Orleans.
Cheers. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.